สวัสดีนะคะวันนี้เรามีโอกาสที่ดีมากจะได้คุยกับคุณไซมอนแลนดี้ซึ่งเป็นนักเขียนของหนังสือ The King and the Consul กงสุลและกษัตริย์และกงสุลนะคะ so Simon, what made you want to do this book? Because it seems quite a slightly unusual subject.
Yes, it's true. It's slightly unusual, but it's a moment in history, Thai history, that people know about in general. But there were so many interesting things happening then, and when the period shortly after the British and the foreign interest became more pronounced in Thailand, a lot of things were happening. The first consul arrived just after Sir John Bowring.
So let's just recap actually. I mean, who is the king?
Okay.
Who is the consul?
Okay. Should we start again?
No, just carry on,
Okay.
yeah.
So the king is Rama IV. So we're talking about the period in the 1850s when Rama IV had been on the throne for about 5 years. And he signed a contract, an agreement with the British government to allow free trade or freer trade between Britain and its colonies and Siam. And this was the first international treaty to be signed in that era. And it opened the door to a lot more open economy. And part of the treaty was that the British could send a consul to sit in Thailand, in Siam as it was called then, and look after the interests of the British people. But the story of this book is really about the story of the consul, that first consul who arrived in 1856 with very little experience of diplomacy and no knowledge at all about Siam, and the scrapes and difficulties he got into in trying to establish a presence, and the very tragic end, not only to his life, but to the life of one of his own officers.
I mean, he seems to me a little bit out of his depth, really. And also, at that time, of course, it was very difficult to get any instruction from London, wasn't it? I mean, if he wanted advice, who could he turn to?
Well, exactly. He was totally out of his depth. He knew very little about Siam or diplomacy. London was his ultimate reporting line through the Foreign Office in London. But he had an intermediate line to Sir John Bowring in Hong Kong. So in theory, he could write to Bowring. It would take about a week, maybe 10 days, sometimes longer, 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks coming back, so a month, really, to get a reply from Hong Kong. For London, it would take several months.
Now, one of the things that people have really loved about this book is that it sheds a new light on a certain aspect of Thai law and about property ownership, which has actually endured to this day, hasn't it? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
That's right. Well, one of the issues that the British consul was trying to deal with was that they needed to have a consulate so they could establish their presence and do their duties to the British population. But there was no real mechanism at the time for a foreign government or even a foreign person to establish ownership of land. In the Bowring Treaty, there were certain regulations put in place to facilitate foreign ownership of land, but they were very restrictive. And my own feeling is that this aspect of the Bowring Treaty has never really been explained properly, but it's a very important aspect. Most people look at the Bowring Treaty and think it's about free trade and it's about extraterritorial issues. And of course it is about these issues, but the third element is about foreign ownership of property.
Anyway, so if you want to learn something very new but very old at the same time about Thailand or Siam as it was then, we do urge you to read this book. And in fact, when it came out, lots of Thai people said, ทำไมไม่ทำเป็นภาษาไทยนะคะแล้วตอนนี้ก็มีเล่มภาษาไทยแล้วค่ะกษัตริย์และกงสุลแปลโดยคุณแหม่มนะคะซึ่งเป็นนักแปลที่เก่งมากแล้วก็เดี๋ยวคุณไซมอนจะแนะนำนิดนึงไหมคะภาษาไทยเพราะคุณไซมอนก็พูดภาษาไทยเก่งมาก
ค่ะก็เห็นด้วยนะครับคุณแหม่มแปลเก่งมากนะ เป็นเรื่องที่ว่าน่าสนใจสำหรับคนไทยด้วยนะครับไม่ใช่เฉพาะต่างชาติที่สนใจเรื่องนี้ก็เป็นไม่ว่าจะเป็นเรื่องของกองทุนอังกฤษสมัยนั้นมีข้อมูลค่อนข้างเยอะเกี่ยวกับรัฐบาลสยามโดยเฉพาะนายหลวงพระรามสี่
ใช่ใช่แล้วก็เรื่องสิทธิครอบครองที่ดินอะไรอย่าง
ครับ
เงี้ยนะคะเรื่องอสังหาริมทรัพย์ซึ่งจนบัดนี้คนต่างชาติก็ไม่สามารถจะครอบครองที่ดินได้นะคะคือมีคอนโดได้ก็เลยน่าสนใจมากค่ะคุณไซมอนค่ะขอบคุณมากนะคะ
ครับสวัสดีครับ
สวัสดีค่ะ